You know what? I've been using Rudy for almost 4 months now. I think I can get a new avatar. And who is it going to be? Yeah, I've been watching a lot of MST3K recently, so I decided I'd make my favorite robot my avatar just for a change in visuals. Anyway, you guys ever see a video that you're pretty sure you mostly agree with, but everything about it pisses you off to levels that you didn't even think were possible? Well, that's what today's commentary is. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to Professor Dave Explains. We'll be covering his video, Let's All Get Past This Confusion About Trans People. Or, as I prefer to call it, let's all get past this confusion about trans people. Let's all get past this confusion about trans people. Let's all get past this confusion about trans people and get ourselves a treat.
Hey everyone, I know I don't discuss current events too often, but I'd like to do more of that, and there's one thing happening at the moment that I feel compelled to comment on. Everybody seems to be furious about trans people. Half of us are furious that they exist, and the other half are furious about what the other half is saying.
Coming from somebody who's in the second half, I'm not really mad that transphobes exist so much as I'm mad that they continuously push nonsensical authoritarian legislation like bathroom bills, bills to require genital inspections in schools, and bans on hormone replacement therapy and other forms of transgender healthcare, or pushing downright nonsensical restrictions on transgender healthcare, including absolutely nonsensical age limits, while at the same time smearing transgender people as perverts, sex offenders, and deranged, and smearing the parents of transgender people as abusive, grooming, or pedophilic, primarily based off of the words of liars and frauds like Abigail Shire, Matt Walsh, Graham Lineham, and many others, who are all about as reliable regarding the topic of transgender people as the Russian secret police were on Judaism. Although I would also call doing all that a little bit more than being mad that transgender people exist, so maybe I'm just having a different debate than Professor Dave is. Speaking of this visual, I can't help but notice that it doesn't make reference to, transgender people, the people who this entire debate is about. Instead, it's just one group who's mad at the abstract concept of transgender people for no discernible reason, and another group who, once again, for no discernible reason, is mad at the other side. We'll ignore how this paints the allies as quite literally reactionary and just move on from there, and instead point out how, well, you've removed transgender people from a discussion about transgender people by means of visual.
I would like to jump in and see if I can clear up some of the ways that people are talking past each other.
Yeah, the literal cartoon characters of your own creation that are doing nothing but screaming about how mad they are at the other side with no actual points do seem to be doing a lot of talking past each other.
The primary issue is people who deny transgenderism.
As demonstrated by this picture of someone calling it stupid and therefore confirming that they believe it to be real. Or do you just call things you don't think are real stupid? What would denying transgenderism even look like exactly? Would it involve going up to any person who is transgender and telling them, you literally do not exist? Because that's not an issue transgender people are likely to face. They are much more likely to face transphobia, aka the acknowledgement that they exist and the belief that they should be discriminated against or stigmatized, or just simply don't live a valid way of living.
These are the people who spew the tired Fox News talking points. Liberals say there are 89 genders and anyone can identify as a hamster.
Okay, I assume the 89 genders thing is a reference to non-binary identities, which, yeah, a lot of people do think you can identify as those. I should know I'm one of them. Even though I don't personally identify as non-binary, I do think it is a perfectly valid identity to have. Do you not feel that way? I mean, if so, that's fine, I guess, but just say that. Instead, you're basically calling the existence of non-binary people a Fox News talking point. You're literally saying non-binary people aren't real, just turn off the fucking monitor. As for people identifying as hamsters, well, I've never seen that specifically, but I have seen otherkin who are people that identify as the reincarnation of animals. It's a more spiritual thing, don't get me wrong, and I personally would not compare this to somebody identifying as transgender or non-binary, but it does exist. And again, if you want to claim it's invalid, you should just claim that.
That sort of thing. It's a deliberate caricature of reality peddled by all the angry conservative dudes popping up in my feed lately who claim that nobody can define a woman. Let's all take a moment to acknowledge the problems that go along with the ambiguity of language. Sex and gender are different words that refer to different things. If you did not know that, now you do. Sex is a chromosomal phenomenon. Nearly all of us have 2 sex chromosomes in all of our somatic cells. If both are X, your sex is female. If one is X and one is Y, your sex is male. There are interesting exceptions, like intersex people who exhibit a blend of the phenotypes associated with the 2 sexes due to chromosomal irregularities, as well as chimeric beings who exhibit different genotypes in different cells due to developing from more than one zygote. It is important to discuss and understand these populations. However, we can still safely categorize the overwhelming majority of people as exhibiting either male or female sex.
Okay, I don't really have any issue with the explanation, but I will say that saying an overwhelming majority of people fit into this category is a tad misleading, albeit unintentionally so. For those unaware, intersex people make up 1.7% of the population. In a world of 7.753 billion people, that would mean there are 131 million of them. For comparison, there are 147 million people in Russia and 128 million in Mexico.
Gender is a different phenomenon. It is still biological, but it is a neurochemical construct.
I have, and I mean this with no hyperbole, never heard anybody say this before. In fact, I actually looked up neurochemical gender, and the first thing I found was a Cornell University article from 2000, which says that neurochemicals could be the reason why men and women act differently as opposed to gender, because gender is typically defined as the social constructs created based around being a man or being a woman in the eyes of society.
This means that ultimately it is still genetic in basis, but it absolutely is not determined merely by the sex chromosomes. It is tremendously more complicated, and researchers are still working to understand the biological basis of gender identity.
So, in a video called Let's End All This Confusion About Trans People, your explanation of gender is, I don't know, man, it's really confusing.
Human psychology is complex. People need to deal with that. Thoughts and feelings are ultimately chemical phenomena. We all have a neurochemical profile that guides how we think and feel, and part of that is gender identity.
Source, citation, anything that would make me believe this claim if I was even slightly skeptical of it? No, nothing. Well, okay.
Therefore, when people complain about men choosing to be women, this is very offensive. It is a denial of the concept of gender. It is no different than the conversation that was happening surrounding homosexuality a few decades ago. Conservatives would say that homosexuality is just demons or temptations from Satan, and that heterosexuality is the only way people can truly be. Today, this seems totally ridiculous because homosexuality and other sexual orientations have become accepted and normalized, even among many conservatives. The same will happen for transgenderism because it undeniably exists. The acceptance for suppressed sexual orientations came first because around 10% of people are gay, whereas a much smaller percentage of people are trans.
Actually, historically in the US at least, transgender people have been more normalized than homosexuals have been. Christina Jogson was allowed to get a sex change operation and become a national name half a century before the Supreme Court struck down sodomy laws. Ed Wood was allowed to make Glenn or Glenda while Gore Vidal was on a blacklist for making The City and The Pillar. Neither have had it historically good throughout American history, but transgender people, although at the time they were more likely to be called transvestites or transsexuals, were much closer to normal than homosexuals were until fairly recently.
Now, as promised, with the indictment of conservatives complete, I turn to liberals and the missteps they are enacting that are preventing resolution. Number 1, please stop saying things like gender is a social construct.
So, quick question to you, Professor. If the societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observation of one's sex isn't a social construct, then what is it exactly? For that matter, if this is the case, then why have the concepts of masculinity and femininity differed so much throughout history? Just 1 century ago, pink was considered a masculine color and blue was considered a feminine color. Today, it's the exact opposite in most of the West. At this same point in history, white dresses were entirely gender neutral, as was the term girl, which simply referred to a young child, who would later turn into either a man or a lady. High heels are considered feminine in the West today, but once upon a time they were actually invented for the purpose of archery, and were later co-opted by the aristocracy as a sign of wealth. A man who has sex with a lot of women today is considered to be a playboy, or a pickup artist, or something else along those lines, but in ancient Rome, he would have been considered unmasculine. In fact, in a lot of the 20th century, homosexuality was considered effeminate. In ancient Rome, having sex with women was considered feminine, and having sex with men was considered masculine. You want to look at all of this and tell me this isn't a social construct? Well, okay, you need a very persuasive argument for that, is all I'm going to say. And the best argument you've given is, I don't understand this and it's really confusing. Which is a little hypocritical considering this video is specifically about stopping confusion, by the way. I know I already pointed that out, but I can't get over that.
No, it is not. It is a biological construct.
Out of curiosity, do you believe men evolved to hunt giraffes?
Society can't turn you trans any more than it can turn you gay. Gender is determined biologically. It is simply that, again, gender is not determined merely by the sex chromosomes and is an incredibly complex neurochemical phenomenon.
You need a very high IQ to understand gender.
In addition, sex is a much more easily definable biological construct, and we must acknowledge that when an individual that is of the male biological sex identifies as trans, their biological sex remains male. By identifying as trans, their chromosomes do not change, no matter what surgeries they choose to undergo. We rightfully refer to them as women because most of us have decided that it is appropriate for a society to respect their gender identity over their biological sex.
Or because we genuinely believe them to be women? Again, what is it with transphobes and not being able to comprehend the idea that people do not agree with them?
When liberals attempt to decouple gender or even sex from its biological basis, they give conservatives license for mockery, because they can then rightfully criticize what seems to them like a vague and meaningless declaration.
Unlike your incredibly clear and meaningful declaration of, it's complicated. Also, what do you mean by seems to them? Is it or isn't it? If it is, you should criticize it on that basis, not on the basis that other people think it is. What you're doing is basically the some people say trick, which I should note is actually a Fox News talking point.
That's why smug, ignorant conservatives who make a living stirring up hatred amongst bigots get so much traction by cutting together cherry-picked compilations of young people saying silly things, like gender is a social construct, because they get to go look at the dumb liberals, and it is a rare instance where they aren't completely wrong. This emboldens them and makes them feel justified in pushing other talking points that are completely wrong.
So here's a question. If they're willing to push talking points that you admit are completely wrong anyway, why does the other side supposedly being wrong in one instance therefore embolden them? Even if the other side were right about everything, how do you know they just wouldn't start pushing talking points that are completely fractally wrong on every single level? Anyway, that's all I want to cover from this video, so final thoughts? If I were to sum up this video in one word, it would most likely be confusing. Although I certainly do think that debunking transphobia is necessary, the method of doing so should not be through ignoring groups of people that objectively exist, nor through essentially backpedaling on very important claims. If the professor here wants to talk about what would make us look like a laughingstock to the other side, I would say backpedaling would do that much more than continuously defending premises that sound kind of silly at first. I also don't think that arguments should be judged by how the opposite side responds and should instead just be judged by their own merits, but hey, I guess I'm kind of silly like that. Good night and good luck.